A report on 3 news articles on laboratory accidents, prepared by Group 2. News headlines: Michelle Dufault, 11, dies in Sterling Chemistry Laboratory accident. University of Hawaii finds lab explosion slashed by 40%. A young lab worker, a professor, and a deadly accident. News article number 1. Michelle Dufault, 11, dies in Sterling Chemistry Laboratory accident. Reported by Kate Lindo.
A student in Yale University died in Sterling Chemistry Laboratory accident. April 12, 2011, Michelle Dufault, a senior astronomy and physics major from the Yale University, has died due to an accident in the Sterling Chemistry Laboratory. The accident happened when Michelle's hair became trapped in one of the laboratory's moveways when she was working in the machine shop. A lathe is a big machine used in woodworking and metalworking that uses a rotating mechanism to shape things. Dufault's body was discovered by the other students in the building and alerted the authorities who arrived on the spot. Furthermore, in an autopsy made by the Connecticut Medical Examiner's Office, asphyxia from neck compression was determined to be the cause of the accident fatality. The U.S. Department of Labor's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, opened an investigation and told Yale that the lathe lacked essential protections, and the school's rules and procedures for using it were unsafe. There were missing critical features in the lathe, including an emergency shutoff and a guard or shield to protect the person using the lathe. Other safety problems were discovered at the shop, including missing warning signs and poor record keeping. It was also added that operating the lathe alone violates basic safety guidelines too. However, Yale disputed OSHA's claims and said that the assessment contained significant inaccuracies. In the end, the university has begun to implement recommended policies and practices of its machine shops and equipment. Lastly, Yale was not fined by OSHA because it lacked the authority to do so in situations involving students rather than workers.
Preventive measures.
In order to prevent the accident that has happened to Michelle Dufault, one must remember these simple laboratory preventive measures. Number 1. Determine the potential hazards and appropriate safety precautions before beginning any work. And number 2. Avoid working alone in a building. Do not work alone in a laboratory if the procedures being conducted are hazardous.
News article number 2. University of Hawaii finds lab explosion slashed by 40%. Reported by Valentina Rhea Lumapas.
University of Hawaii fines for lab explosion slashed by 40%. This was an article that was published on 14th October 2016 by Rebecca Trager. The article talked about the lab explosion incident at the University of Hawaii last March 2016. The explosion involved Thea Ekins Coward, who lost her arm because of the said incident. The visiting postdoctoral research fellow, Thea Ekins Coward, was said to be mixing hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide from separate cylinders. And as she was creating the growth medium for a microorganism, a static discharge triggered an explosion. September that year, when the Hawaii Occupational Safety and Health Division found out that the University of Hawaii failed to provide a safe workplace for their employees, by not reducing their exposure to possible explosion and fire hazards, and also by the lack of periodic in-house lab inspections. Since the accident, the university's Office of the Vice Chancellor of Research has created a Chemical and Physical Hazards Committee to promote a greater awareness and commitment to health and safety in its research and teaching laboratories. This committee will request that each principal investigator at the university submit a chemical inventory and complete a physical hazard survey.
Preventive measures.
In order to prevent accidents like this from happening, all laboratory personnel should place emphasis on safety and chemical hygiene at all times. Equipment should also be maintained according to the manufacturer's requirements and records of certification. Maintenance or repairs should be maintained for the life of the equipment. We should also determine the potential hazards and appropriate safety precautions before beginning any work. Or, we can also take note of the acronym RAM, which stands for Recognize the Hazards, Assess the Risks of the Hazards, Minimize the risks of the hazards, and prepare for emergencies from uncontrolled hazards.
News article number 3. A young lab worker, a professor, and a deadly accident. Reported by Leonard Mapa.
The unfortunate accident happened in Los Angeles in the UCLA Molecular Sciences building. The campus was mostly deserted for Christmas break. Not until Sherry Sanji's scream split the camp in December 29, 2008. Sanji was working on a reaction involving tert-butyllithium. She was 23 and had earned her bachelor's degree that spring. 2 older postdoctoral fellows were engrossed in their own work nearby. Patrick Haran, the chemistry professor who had hired Sanji as the research associate 2 months earlier, was in his office 1 floor up. Tert-butyllithium, or TBULI for short, is what is known as pyrophoric. It ignites spontaneously in air. Sanji picked up a plastic syringe and began drawing up to 54 milliliters quantities. And suddenly, one of the postdocs heard Sanji scream. He looked up and saw her on fire. He tried wrapping his lab coat around her, but that caught fire too. The other postdoc called 911 and ran to find Haran. When Haran arrived, Sanji was sitting on the floor with her arms outstretched, shaking. Her synthetic sweatshirt had burned away, and large blisters were beginning to form on her abdomen. The skin was separating from her hands. She had not been wearing a lab coat. The systematic failures that led to Sanji's death began accumulating well before the day a young, inexperienced woman was permitted to undertake a dangerous experiment alone. California workplace safety investigators concluded in 2009 report. She was never properly trained or even issued a lab coat. Haran's lab had been cited for safety problems but given an extension on the cleanup date, and in earlier incidents, 2 other students were seriously burned at UCLA labs, but nothing at the school changed. The company that manufactures the TBULI that Sanji was using, Sigma Aldrich, provided a bulletin for the safe handling of pyrophoric and air-sensitive chemicals. The bulletin states that up to 50 milliliters may be transferred with 1 to 2 foot needle. However, Sanji was transferring 54 milliliters with a 2-inch needle. She would have had to hold the bottle by hand and tip it forward herself so the short needle could reach the top of the TBULI. The bulletin indicated the syringe should be glass and should only be used for a single transfer, or else the syringe might freeze up or become plugged. Sanji was using the same syringe, a plastic one with plastic locks, for all 3 transfers she needed to make. Nobody involved in Sanji's story claims her death was anything other than tragic. But lawyers for Haran, the professor, say that tragedy was rooted in Sanji's own actions. She was an experienced chemist who botched a basic experiment she had completed successfully before. Her death was an accident, not a crime.
Preventive measures.
First, it is very important to have someone who is an expert or professional to assist us when conducting experiments. In the article, what Sanji did was very risky. She performed a dangerous procedure alone. Even though it was stated that she already successfully done some dangerous experiments, we should instill in our minds that it is far different having a professional while executing procedures than doing it solo. Always put safety first. Avoid overconfidence. Next is when doing something with potential hazards, especially with chemicals, always wear an appropriate attire or PPE. We will never know what will happen in the future, but we have the option to prepare and be ready. Unfortunately, Sanji wasn't. She conducted the procedure without the appropriate attire, which made the fire to easily burn her synthetic sweatshirt. It was stated that she had not been wearing a lab coat. Third is knowing the usage limitation of chemicals and its possible hazards. The chemical used in the accident was tert-butyllithium. The manufacturer of that chemical provided a bulletin about how to use and handle it safely. It was instructed that up to 50 milliliters may be transferred with 1 to 2 foot needle. Sanji did the experiment, but she used 54 milliliters using a 2-inch needle. It was obvious that she did not saw the bulletin, so understanding chemicals is a must. Last is using the appropriate equipment, tools, or materials in dealing with different chemicals. Back to the bulletin, it was also indicated that the syringe should be a glass and should only be used for a single transfer. She needed to perform 3 transfers of the chemical, but on the contrary, Sanji only used 1 syringe and was a plastic one with plastic locks, which contributed and led to a deadly accident.